So we're going to do an exercise first, if I can have the first slide. So I want everyone to think about a place that was special to them as a young person, just somewhere you like to be, somewhere you like to hang out, a place that was special to you. Okay? And so think about, if you know what it's like now, what is that place like now? Okay? And then think about what you want it to be like 20 years from now, or longer. Next, please. So how are we going to get from here to there? And so take 2 minutes and talk to people at your table about those things. And then we'll talk about it a little bit. And I promise this is all related to climate. All right, does someone want to tell us what the answers to some of these questions are?
So just trying to steward and protect the ecosystem that is currently in place, and then using managing practices to not only keep it in place, but also reduce the carbon footprint.
Great, thank you. All right, one more if anyone wants to do it. Okay, we don't have to. Could I have the next slide, please? So anytime I talk about climate change, and especially talking about natural systems or semi-natural systems, I want to keep in mind that even if climate change was not happening, there would be all kinds of stresses going on to ecosystems and species that we use for economic reasons, that we care about, that are just plain old important to us. And there's a concept, how many of you have heard of IPAT? Okay, at least some people have heard of this. For those who haven't, this is a general concept that was originated about 50 years ago by Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren. And it's not a literal equation. It's not something where you put numbers in and get an answer to the equation. But it's a concept that people's effect on the environment is a function of the number of people in the world or in any area. It's a number of people, their affluence, which you can think of as their resource consumption, and technology. And so the number of people does matter, their consumption does matter, and technology can either increase resource use per capita or decrease resource use per capita. They meant environment to mean everything, so mental health, physical health, infrastructure, and all the natural stuff. And so the world's population probably will level within the next 100 years. The population of the United States probably will level within 100 years, although migration is a real big unknown. Oregon's population is going up quite a bit and probably will continue going up quite a bit. Oregon is still a relatively nice place, even with all of the climate threats. When Cascadia blows, we'll see whether Oregon's population keeps going up. But at any rate, this is just something that I always like to start with, to keep in mind that it's not just climate change. And a risk, I think, of talking about climate change in isolation is that it's easy to forget that all of these other things are going on, and they would be a big factor to deal with, even if the climate was not changing. So, please. Thank you. Okay, so I don't know if anyone has talked about this yet. I came in part of the last conversations, but I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about climate and weather, because especially when there is an impetus not to say the words climate change and to instead focus on variability and what have you, sometimes it can be a little bit easy to lose sight of the fact that climate and weather are different. Well, they're sort of different. Weather is what's happening today and next week. Weather is what's happening over a couple days. When I was driving up here from Corvallis, I was going through patchy fog. That's weather. Climate is the statistics of weather. So if I talk about over the last 20 years, how often has there been patchy fog in mid-December? That would be climate. If I talk about how much precipitation have we received this fall compared to how much we often receive at this point over the past 20 years or so, that would be climate. We tend to think about climate, I think, as a physical science. So what's being measured, we often talk about atmospheric physics. All of that is true. But climate also is highly responsive to the natural environment. So climate responds to topography. If you think about the fact that it's usually colder and wetter at high elevations than low elevations. Vegetation, you think about some of the feedbacks, especially with dry ecosystems where the evaporation tends to be high, or you think about maybe rainforests where there tends to be a lot of feedbacks in terms of moisture patterns, soil conditions, you name it. So climate also is really responsive to what is on the ground. Next, please. Okay, so climate data. If you're obtaining climate data, often you'll either get points, so you can look at a station. So I might say, okay, my closest station that has really reliable weather measurements is the Corvallis Airport. So I can get data from that point. Or I can get data, airports tend to have really good weather data. I can get data from points around the country or around the world. I can also get what looks like a continuous surface. So it's often called a grid, or the jargon is often wall-to-wall coverage. And that's interpolated data, right? So that'll be how I can obtain different types of data. And so basically, most station measurements, most point observations are incorporated into climate models in a way. And the sort of ease with which, or the reliability with which one can interpolate from those observations at a point to pretending that it's a continuous measurement surface, that varies somewhat. So there's differences in how easy climate variables are to measure. So both temperature and precipitation are really easy to measure. You can put up a rain gauge. I'll make a plug. How many of you have heard of CocoRa's? Excellent. Tell your friends about it. Great activity to do at home for yourself, because we all like doing this too. It's also really good if you have kids, at home with you in a classroom setting, what have you. So precipitation is easy to measure. Temperature is easy to measure. Temperature is much easier to interpolate, or much more reliable to interpolate, generally because it is somewhat less sensitive than precipitation to how bumpy the Earth's surface is and whatever is growing on the Earth's surface. So this is just a sense of some things are easier to make predictions about or make projections about than others. Yes, please. So then climate models, when we're talking about modeling past climate and comparing it to what was observed, which is one of the ways that climate models are tested, or making projections out into the future, you'll sometimes hear about global climate models. And so when you're running a global climate model, it's really computationally intensive. Also, we have a pretty high density of weather observations in the United States. Many developed countries have a pretty high density of weather stations, not so much across really large parts of the world. So for all kinds of reasons, those global climate models are usually run on a grid where the cells are roughly 60 miles on a side. 60 miles? 60 miles. So great big squares. And all of most of these are based on atmospheric physics. Some of them are also based on those interactions between the atmosphere and topography and vegetation and what have you. All of the future projections make assumptions about human behavior. And so when you think about, okay, there's a high projection, there's a low projection, they tend to have arcane letters and numbers like RCP 8.5 and SSP some number hyphenated some number, and you look at them and you go, I'm in this field and I can't even figure out what the heck these things mean. But all of those make assumptions about human behavior. They make assumptions about rates of emissions of greenhouse gases. So even the most things that we think of often as sort of just the most basic atmospheric physics, they are strongly related to human behavior. Next, please. And so then, how many of you have heard of downscaling? Okay, cool. So in many cases, those 60 miles to a side grid cells, they are great if you're trying to look at what's happening worldwide or nationwide. They're not so helpful if you're trying to figure out what to do in your county or what things might be like for a particular local agricultural crop or something like that. So there's this process called downscaling, which is basically taking those, taking the global climate models and bringing it down to something that's useful for local decision making. And so that's not just a process of hacking up a great big grid square into lots of little grid squares. A couple different ways of downscaling. One of the ones that is most common and most reliable is you take the projections from the global model and you compare them to what's actually happening on the ground at those observation stations, at airports, or wherever else. And you can adjust the local outputs on the basis of what you know about long-term climate in a particular location. And so that lets you make projections that are more fine-grained and more realistic of what's happening in your particular area. A caveat with this is that the cells wind up being pretty small, so a lot of them now are 6 kilometers on a side, so a couple miles on a side. In many cases, they're getting to be smaller squares over time. So you see lots and lots of small squares, and there's this temptation to say, well, I live in this square, or I work in this square, and I know what's happening here, and the model output for this square doesn't reflect what I know to be real, and so this model must be a piece of junk. No, that's not the point. So the point is to not to look at one small square. It's not a prediction for a particular square, but to say in general what's happening in a local area compared to what's happening over a larger area. And if you evaluate those downscaled models in that light, that it's not one square, but it's sort of the aggregate over a moderately local area, that's generally how those are evaluated. And they're often pretty, in the Western United States, they're often pretty darn good because we're really lucky. We have a lot of resources, we know a lot about our climate, and we have a lot of people focusing on climate in this region. So next, please. Okay, so a program, how many of you are familiar with Oregon Master Naturalist? Decent number of people. If you are not, it's run through OSU Extension. It is a fantastic program. It just got a big award a couple of weeks ago. You can read all about it by using your Google search skills. So a program that is going to tier off of the Oregon Master Naturalist program, and the Master Naturalist program is nationwide, it's not just Oregon. If I could have the next slide. We're starting a program called Climate Stewards. And so Master Naturalist is sort of like Master Gardener, and Climate Stewards is sort of like those things. It's a program that is geared toward adult learners. It is ultimately training people to engage with their community on community action, on community resilience. It's a 40-hour course that is online. Is it going to be done in person? I think it will be done in person and probably ultimately online. So Master Naturalist is done in lots of states. Oregon is only the second state to be doing a Climate Steward program. It was developed by University of California Extension. There's a capstone course, and although it's designed for pretty much adult education or continuing education, it is highly applicable to what you might do in classrooms, especially with high school students. So some of the tenets of it: participatory science, a lot of attention paid to social and emotional resilience. So a lot of the things that I think the next speaker is going to be discussing, and that are probably being incorporated, that you're probably incorporating into your classrooms already. Also, development of communities of practice, so basically networking with people around the state or potentially in other states that are also working on these types of issues in their communities and in their schools. So if you are interested in this, it is starting up. And if you go to the Oregon Master Naturalist site and contact the point of contact for Oregon Master Naturalist, who's Jason O'Brien, or contact me, we can let you know as this program spins up in the next year or two if you want to be one of the first couple people in the first couple cohorts. So next, please. Other things about the program, I've probably covered most of this. You can read. Okay. So I was going to talk, what to talk about. I decided to talk a bit about drought and what's going on with drought. So west-wide, the West is becoming drier. Why is the West becoming drier? What do you think contributes to drought? Yeah, so the longer seasons of heat was one person just mentioned. What else? I think I heard less rain. All of these things. Yeah, next please. So drought, there are a bunch of different ways of defining drought and measuring drought. And it doesn't, it doesn't really matter what all of them are. The things that I think are worth pointing out in this context, that drought can be defined on the basis of the atmosphere, so how thirsty the atmosphere is. Drought also can be defined on the basis of how thirsty the soil is. In some cases, depending what you're doing, you might care more about one or the other. Drought can be defined relative to sort of physical variables, like just how much water is coming into the system, how much water is going out of the system. It can be defined relative to some of the effects of that water balance, so it can be defined relative to agricultural systems or ecological systems. Lots and lots of ways of defining drought and looking at drought over different periods of time, regardless of how you look at drought. So, okay, two things to think about. One is that when someone says drought, sometimes it's relevant to say, how are you defining drought and how are you measuring drought, to know what it really means in a particular context, especially if you're hearing statistics about drought. Okay, where's that coming from? Regardless of how you define it, regardless of how you measure it, in Oregon and almost all of the West, drought is becoming more frequent, it's becoming longer, and it's becoming more intense. So more and more water limitation in the future. Next, please. And so then what is contributing to drought? Or if you think about sort of the process of drought becoming more of a pain in our necks, the process of aridification over long periods of time, a whole bunch of things that are contributing to that. So the first one that I think we always tend to think about is the input of water, so the precipitation supply. And it is absolutely true that over the past couple years, there has not been a whole lot of precipitation, especially seasonally across much of the West. But that is not the only thing that's going on. Yeah, so precipitation in Oregon, if you look at it over time, and most of what I'm saying is applicable to much of the western United States. If you look at climate, so again, the statistics of weather, our precipitation in Oregon is actually fairly stable or increasing slightly, even though we've had a couple years in which precipitation has been quite low. But there are a couple changes in how the precipitation is coming. And so we, as temperatures are increasing, we're getting more precipitation as rain and less as snow. We're getting more precipitation in winter, more of our precipitation in winter and less in summer. You might think, as I did, I've only lived in Oregon for about 3 years, summer's really dry anyway. Why are we talking about there being less in summer? Because there's not that much in summer in the first place. Largely true, but especially in June, we're getting less precipitation in summer, and it makes a difference because we need it in summer so badly. A big factor is the snowpack, and the fact that we're getting smaller and smaller snowpack, that the snowpack is melting faster. So basically, even if we're getting more precipitation, as temperatures increase, per unit precipitation, it's going away faster, or it's becoming less available to us faster. Next, please. So the change in precipitation is also affecting flood patterns across the state. We are more likely to get floods when we have rain instead of snow. The seasonality is changing somewhat. It depends a bit which major river system you're on. The Willamette, the seasonality of floods is not likely to change all that much. It's hard to see this. If you look at the blue blobs are the past, or up until now, the seasonality of floods. This down here is the months. So if you just look at the position of the blue blobs relative to the green blobs, that shows you where the seasonality of floods is roughly now compared to what it might be in the future. So if you look along the bottom, which is the Snake River Basin, floods are likely to come earlier, and they're likely to span a longer period of time. So all of the changes in seasonality of precipitation are also affecting flood patterns. Next, please. Okay, and then you were talking about temperature. So temperature is also a major contributor to drought, and it is getting hotter. Next, please. Getting hotter everywhere. It is likely to be about 5 degrees hotter in Oregon by the end of this century than it was around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Big factors, we're getting warmer nights. So we're getting warmer days and warmer nights, but in a relative sense, nights are warming faster than days. And that is a big problem for public health. It has a big effect on basically any organism being able to cool off at night. It's more difficult to cool off through passive cooling, and has major effects on Oregon's potential energy use because we're not in that hot of a state. I mean, even in the relatively hot areas, it cools off a lot at night. People are used to not necessarily having air conditioning, throwing open their windows at night, being able to cool off. That's becoming more difficult. And we're getting, by any standard, more hot days. It's getting hotter on those days. Some of the consequences that have come up a lot. So often in sort of climate change world, one hears about one of the effects of increases in temperature being increases in the pollen season. And what you tend to hear is that there's going to be more pollen, and it's going to be around for longer. And if you suffer from hay fever, this is going to be horrendous. Next slide, please. What I'm starting to see, and really curious if any of you are hearing about this, and Heidi, I'd be really curious if you're hearing about this. There's not that much in the scientific literature yet about effects of increased heat on agricultural pollen, but there's starting to be more that I'm seeing in professional publications and sort of anecdotally that across at least some parts of the country, a concern that basically pollen is going to cook before plants get pollinated. And so that this may have a pretty detrimental effect on agriculture and food supply. Next, please. Also that the changes in pollen in agriculture may affect the bees that are pollinating some of the crops. It takes more nutrients from pollen to grow a female bee than a male bee. And so there may be changes in bee sex ratios and all kinds of cascading effects. But basically, you just depending on the sector you move in, the effects of heat on pollen and pollen loads may vary quite a bit depending on which plants you're talking about, whether they're what we consider weeds or what we consider food. Next, please. So a couple other contributors to aridity, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but some of the other big ones are wind speed and solar radiation and humidity. And what contributes the most, or the relative contribution of the 5 factors that I talked about to drought, varies in space and it varies in time. And what is driving drought, also each of those variables has an effect on natural organisms. So I studied butterflies, and I'll talk a little bit about butterflies, but butterflies respond to solar radiation a fair bit. Other organisms might respond to humidity more. So just basically what's driving drought in and of itself also has an effect. The changes in those variables also have an effect on native and non-native species. Okay. One of the big reasons that people are concerned about drought in Oregon, agriculture is a huge one. Wildfires are another really huge one. So as vegetation dries out, obviously fires are easier to ignite. It's easier for them to spread. It's as simple to think about as just if you're trying to build a fire in a fireplace or build a campfire, you don't build it with super wet wood, you build it with dry wood. The number of large fires is increasing more than the number of small fires. The extent to which aridity makes wildfire growth possible becomes a much bigger deal when there are strong winds. In Western Oregon, we tend to worry a lot about those strong east winds. So people often are asking, okay, well, what's happening with winds and climate change? Winds are not really changing, but if you have drought becoming more common and you have higher temperatures, when there is a strong wind, it is more likely to coincide with really dry vegetation and high temperatures. So basically the other conditions that are around when the wind blows really hard, that's what's increasing the likelihood of fires that are quite difficult to control and can be really detrimental to human communities. The elevation of wildfires also is increasing. So wildfires used to not spread into super high elevations. The elevation of wildfires is tending to increase because those elevations don't have as much snow. They're drying out faster, and it's easier for fires to spread higher. Yeah, okay. Another consequence, so then carrying over to consequences of aridity making wildfires more likely, is pollutants in our air. So people have been trying to forecast changes in the number of days with smoke and the concentration of fine particles on those days. So basically, this is all the joyful stuff. It's likely that there are going to be, depending on the area, not all areas are likely to have more actual days of smoke, depends where you are in Oregon, but in all likelihood, there's going to be more fine particulates in the air on those days. So people are trying to forecast what are sometimes being called smoke wave days and think about the extent to which the change in fire patterns is going to have an effect on a lot of measures of human health. All kinds of really good research emerging on what these changes mean for human health. It is both depressing and fascinating. And some of the lingering effects of even relatively short-term exposures on children's health or fetal exposures. Big changes in human health. Yeah. Okay, so what can one do? Well, you can't start a fire without having an ignition source. And across much of the western United States, across much of the country, the vast majority of ignitions are human-caused. This does not mean that people are going out and being arsonists. There are some arson fires, but more what it means is that anytime there are people just going about the business of daily life, they're going to create sparks. We create sparks inadvertently when we're doing yard work, with our cars, with electricity lines. Basically, everything that people do at some point is going to create a spark. And so most of the ignitions are human-caused. And there's a lot of focus now on trying to reduce the likelihood of all of those human causes of ignitions. And so, Oregon is just starting to, in some cases, do what California's done for about 10 years now of what are called, the euphemism is public safety power shutoffs. So basically turning off the electricity when the winds are really high and the vegetation is really dry. Whether that works, we don't know yet because it hasn't been going on for enough time. But utilities increasingly think that it is at least worth a shot. All kinds of targeted messaging about what's the best way to communicate to people that fire risk is high and that it would be great if you would not do things in your yard today with anything metallic, or campfire restrictions or anything like that. So a lot of focus on how to reduce the likelihood of ignitions. Next, please. So in general, despite all of that, it's likely that, that these trends are going to continue, of area burned increasing. This is more a factor east of the Cascades, where wildfires tend to be more common in the first place, than west of the Cascades. So west of the Cascades, it's an interesting situation where, broad sweeping generalization, you either don't have fires or you have really big fires. And so what happens there is that the vegetation west of the Cascades tends to be pretty wet. It's hard to get a fire started unless there is a really strong wind and things are quite dry. And those are the conditions that are conducive to a very large, difficult to control fire. So west of the Cascades, again, broad sweeping generalization, you either don't get a fire or you get a really big fire. East of the Cascades, it's more likely that you get the smaller fires. Anyway, we can continue. So next is great. But okay, so I know that there are differences of opinion on this, and there's some scientific debate on this. Where I come down on is the fact that one of the best things that people can do to not be at risk themselves, their home, their lives, their property, is home hardening. This is not necessarily cheap. It's not all that difficult, but it's not necessarily cheap. But it is really effective, and it is much more likely to save homes and to save lives than trying to fight a conflagration, which can't be done. And so increasingly, communities are looking at what they can do in terms of building materials. The building industry is going through conniption fits about what they can do and what they should have to do. But there are a lot of things that can be done with home ventilation systems, with building materials, with not putting mulch right up against the side of a house. Most home most wildfires, most homes that burned down in wildfires, the home was not ignited by the trees next to the house. It was ignited by sparks that blew a fair way from the fire front. So changing ventilation systems so that basically sparks don't blow into the interior of a house and more or less light the house from the inside, that's one of the most effective ways to harden homes from wildfires. So this is something that people can do. Not necessarily cheap, but can be extremely successful. Next, please. Some other factors contributing to wildfires, especially east of the Cascades, non-native invasive grasses. So have anyone heard of cheatgrass? Cheatgrass is a bad, bad plant. Everyone can agree on that. And it tends to, cheatgrass does a great job from the perspective of cheatgrass. So it comes into any disturbed ground. If you are blading a roadside and there's cheatgrass around, cattle grazing, wildfire, any kind of ground disturbance, cheatgrass comes right in and sets up. And then cheatgrass itself is really highly flammable. So you tend to get in areas where even where there's not a lot of cheatgrass. Once cheatgrass is in a system, you tend to get more frequent fires and larger fires. And cheatgrass is very difficult to eradicate, but it is also changing the fire cycle. And it's one of the things that would be changing the fire cycle even if climate wasn't changing. Cheatgrass has been having major effects across the West for decades and longer. So fuels management, again, there's debate about this. I think it's a great example of everyone behaving not all that well in some of the debates about what are often called fuels management. So where I come down on this, west of the Cascades, not likely to be super effective. Because, again, the fires west of the Cascades, the ones that are really damaging tend to be wind-driven. And when you have these major wind-driven fires, everything in the path of the fire is going to burn. In some ecosystems, fuels management can be effective, but it has to be maintained. And in a lot of cases, especially communities, you'll see funding for some kind of initial vegetation management or vegetation clearing in areas with a high fire hazard. There's not necessarily money for maintenance. And I mean, if you think about just the nature of a lot of Oregon, even some of the drier areas, stuff grows back. So, a one-time removal is not going to be very effective. There's also the fact that in the areas, especially east of the Cascades, again, ground disturbance creates great conditions for non-native plants. So vegetation removal often looks a lot like this, and when I see that bladed swath, I think cheatgrass is going to have a party if there's not a lot of maintenance in those areas. So there can be these unintended consequences of removing trees and brush in terms of the understory can come back really weedy and really flammable. The other thing to think about, because I'm an ecologist, is what I sometimes think about and say is that trees don't levitate. So, I mean, fuels management is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is removing plants. And removing plants has all kinds of consequences, some of which might be desirable and some of which might not be. I'm not setting a value about the trade-offs, what have you, but a lot of plant removal means a lot of ecological consequences that people may or may not want. So next, please. So it would be really nice if the world would adapt to us, but that is not going to happen. And organisms are adapting to the world around them. So I'm just going to talk about this a little bit because it's more fun for all of us to talk, and I'm talking a lot. So next, please. Climate change, not necessarily catastrophic to all species. What tends to happen is that there's already been a lot of changes in land use, like we talked about initially. So the species that are getting hammered by climate change, generally speaking, it's one more stressor in their lives. They likely were already losing a lot of their habitat to changes in land use, to changes in human activity. So the effects of climate change depend a lot on the particular organism. They depend a lot on whether the organism occurs over a large area. Sort of a lot of people use the analogy, sort of how diverse is the organism's portfolio? Is there genetic diversity? Is there topographic diversity? Is there the potential for the organism to adapt to climate change and other environmental changes? And I take a lot of heart from the fact that nature is creative. Nature is often more creative than we give it credit for. And There are some organisms that are toast, but a lot of them are not. And humans, I have found this really interesting. Even though there's been a movement, at least in the United States over the past 20 or 30 years, to kind of understand that ecosystems change. And we shouldn't think that everything is always going to be exactly the way it is right now. That we should be able to manage ecosystems for adaptation, for change, for evolution with, both in the big sense and in the little sense. We tend to get very upset by the notion that species ranges might shift. That an area that is currently this particular deciduous tree might be something else in the future, or this particular coniferous tree might be something else in the future. But if you look at it from the organism's perspective, they're adapting. They're moving to different places. They're breeding with different species. They're doing all kinds of things to survive. And so nature's creative. It's kind of humans getting bent out of shape because things are changing. But it doesn't mean an ecosystem is gone because the species that are in it have changed. A lot of species are going to persist. Yeah. I'm going to skip this because you already had a great presentation on marine systems, so we can skip that too. I'm going to just bust a couple myths, and then I would much rather us talk. So how many people have heard the notion that we'll go with butterflies. Butterflies have really tight associations with the plants that their caterpillars eat, and they're going to they're going to respond to climate in different ways, and the butterflies are going to be toast. So this phenology is changing, absolutely. Birds are migrating earlier, plants are blooming earlier, all kinds of changes in phenology. So plenty of evidence that phenology is changing. There is currently, so this could change in the future, but currently limited evidence that this is creating problems for organisms that rely on each other. So the problem children have so far mostly, and mostly by definition means not never, it means mostly, mostly related to predator-prey relations or maybe parasites, things like that, other antagonistic interactions, and mostly at pretty high latitudes. So phenology changing, yes. Notion that this is creating ecological havoc, not a whole lot of evidence that this is havoc. Next. And I love bashing this. So how many of you have heard butterflies are super sensitive? Not true. Next, please. So they are super sensitive to their environment, but they're basically like weather vanes with wings. So they are super sensitive to weather on a short-term basis. They also have all kinds of adaptations to their environment. So the idea that whether a butterfly this year, I'm not talking about a really long-term trend, this year numbers of a particular butterfly species are low, next year they're high, that doesn't mean everything is great or everything is in horrible shape. That's what they do. They're like little weather vanes. Next, please. And this gives me also a lot of hope because very few species of butterflies, so, again, oh my gosh, they have really tight relations with their host plants. True up to a point, but very few butterfly species can only feed on one plant species. And that's an evolutionary thing because if you can only feed on one thing and there's, let's say, a hard freeze that wipes out that plant, you're wiped out. So evolution has done a good job of taking care of that. Next, please. There's usually some flexibility, some other related plants that the butterflies can switch to. And so, again, this is a way of natural organisms or of natural populations kind of having a broad portfolio that lets them adapt more easily. So this is a case of a butterfly species that occurs across the West that's really well known, where there are two different plants that it can feed on. And butterflies, so birds kind of show up all at once. Butterflies have a much longer season. Some of the adult butterflies emerge from caterpillars pretty early in the season, some later. And so the female butterflies are laying eggs at different times. And so the selection of plants varies. And basically, if you they can take advantage of different things. There are different trade-offs. On one plant, this yellow plant, it's available later in the season, but really late in the season because of where they're laying their eggs, there's more of a likelihood that the eggs will cook because they're close to the ground and the ground is hot. And that's actually an interesting thing because the butterflies, this particular species over time, it's laying eggs on that plant closer to the ground because the plant is grazed by cows and the cows nip off the top part. So over time, the butterflies have evolved to lay their eggs on the lower part, and the lower part, which is closer to the ground and the ground heat, is where the eggs tend to cook. So again, you see this, to me, really interesting, although kind of a bummer, intersection of changes from human land use interacting with changes in climate. And I think I'm just going to pause there so that we can talk, because I've been talking for long enough. So, thoughts, questions, observations? Yeah.
OSB, thank you. With the OSB butterfly, if there's more than just that early blooming violet that you're aware of?
So with violets, it's an interesting thing. So the genus Spirea, which that species is, most Spirea will feed on any violet in the laboratory. So it probably could feed on any violet. I don't know that Spirea feed on things other than violets. But there are multiple species of violets, and these are butterflies that they're really powerful flyers. So anyway, I would be happy to talk about Spirea. Spirea periodically, they'll take off to weird places and go far outside a habitat. So chances are there are some other things, at least multiple species of violets. Yeah.
So the humidity or the moisture demand, vapor pressure deficit for the technical term, that seems to be one of the main drivers of some of our species that are used to more humid environments, so like the red cedar and red alder, they're really struggling. I'm wondering how much that might actually make more major range shifts for some of those species, and what kind of signal do you see in changes in humidity and vapor pressure deficit in Oregon?
Yeah. It is becoming drier by those metrics. I think a lot of the work on sort of, how are these aridity measures related to changes in species ranges and what have you, I think that is just starting to really emerge. There have been all kinds of species models that have been based on temperature and precipitation and often on averages, and not necessarily looking as much at extremes. So I think that the variables that people are looking at relative to species distributions are getting better informed. And there does seem to be a pretty high signal related to those measures of dryness, which is not necessarily precipitation, but it's just starting to become more widespread. My opinion is that ecologists are just starting to get a clue about climate. Not just that, it's getting hotter and precipitation patterns are changing, but sort of some of the nuances and the different variables that might relate to what organisms do. So I think of it almost like I didn't get dressed this morning on the basis of mean temperature on December 15th. It was sort of, it's 25, maybe I should wear a scarf. And organisms kind of do the same thing. So a lot of the studies on species for a while, I'm generalizing again, have been on temperature means. Okay, well, that's not necessarily all that helpful. People are starting to look at, what about the extremes? What about a particular heat event that maybe had some long-lasting effects or that created some additional stresses? Or what happens when you have multiple stresses interacting? So that's kind of a long answer. It is, from what I've seen, it is creating a signal, and I would not be surprised if there was kind of a flush of studies in future years where people are realizing, this is really sort of the interactions that are driving some of the species responses that may not be all that much associated with precipitation per se. Yeah.
Humans, like you've been talking about the interactions, the ecological interactions, and how species are adapting. But, it almost begs the question, should we be doing something other than observing it? Or what can we do to kind of mitigate, and what's appropriate, given that if you also use a lens of nature's going to do what nature does? It kind of goes back to your first question, what do you want it to look like in 20 years, And I don't know if I'm asking anything specific, but what does it mean for mitigation? Like this, you're kind of...
So, I mean, my opinion is keep lots of open space and keep lots of connected open space, because it's going to be good for something, right? So, I mean, I see a lot, focusing on one species is sometimes a good thing, but focusing on one species to the exclusion of focusing on the vast majority of species, to me, is not necessarily a good thing. So I am not saying do not protect endangered species or get rid of the Endangered Species Act. No, no, no. But what I see, for example, sometimes in California is there might be a species that it's highly threatened, and there's a lot of focus on the ecology of that species and preserving tiny little pieces of remnant habitat for that species. In part, it is the law, so we have to do that. But, you know, sort of in a more general sense, especially when there's an opportunity for mitigation because of development and there are some fairly deep pockets, oh my gosh, instead of protecting this postage stamp when this species is probably not going to do all that well anyway, how about, you know, buying up as much undisturbed land as possible, especially if it's connected to other open areas? No, that species probably isn't going to use it, but a whole bunch of species are. So, I mean, maintaining a lot of open space, maintaining, you know, if you want to think of them as natural areas, I mean, they're often used for recreation, what have you, but just maintaining those areas that are not built up. And ideally maintaining those areas when they have a lot of elevational diversity, a lot of topographic diversity. Because there's also the concept of, I mean, it's often true, but it's somewhat oversimplified, that organisms are moving to higher latitudes and they're moving to higher elevations. Well, if you think about a place that is pretty complex topographically, organisms don't necessarily have to move that far. And there's all kinds of weird things like cold air pooling, so, you know, that where it's actually colder at lower elevations, at least part of the day, than higher elevations. So, you know, preserve as much as you can and hopefully make some of it bumpy. That's my opinion. I mean, again, there's going to be species that lose. But if you're talking about sort of the greatest good for the greatest number, then, gosh, protect open space. Lots of it. Yeah.